On Rosh HaShana, coming up this Shabbat and Sunday, in probably the most moving part of the davening, the Tana Tokef, we say the words Keva korat ro'edo mavir tzono tachat shivto kein tavi v'tispor v'timne v'tifkod nefesh kol chai v'tachtoch kitzva lechol briotecha v'tichtov et gzar dinam. We say in the davening how on Rosh HaShana, just like the shepherd has his flock go in front of him and examines his flock, so we as well pass by in front of Hashem and we are judged and Hashem examines us. This tefillah is actually based on the Mishnah in Masechet Rosh HaShana, where the Mishnah talks about the din on Rosh HaShana. And the Mishnah says, Rosh HaShana kol ba'ei olam ovrim lefanav kivnei maron, that all inhabitants of the world pass by in front of Hashem like b'nei maron. So traditionally we understand b'nei maron meaning like sheep, like we say in the Tana Tokef. But the Gemara in Masechet Rosh HaShana actually gives three possible explanations for the term kivnei maron. The one explanation is like sheep, like we just explained. Another explanation is like Ka'aliyat Beit Maron, like the ascent to Meyron, the town Meyron in the Galil, where the kever of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is. And another explanation is like Kechelot Beit David, like the soldiers of Beit David. When we look at Rashi's explanation for all these possibilities of the phrase Bnei Maron, what's common to all of them is a concept of individuality. In other words, just like sheep, Rashi explains, just like sheep pass through a narrow gate when the shepherd counts them in order to separate ma'asrot, so they pass by one through a narrow gate. Or like the ascent to Beit Maron, it's a very narrow ascent, and there's no room for two people. Or like Chelot Beit David, which Rashi says, Yotzim ze achar ze, that they go out to war, ze achar ze, one after the other. Rav Wolbe in his Sefer Arei Shur points out that the common idea behind all these explanations is this concept of individuality, of a person appearing in front of Hashem all on their own, and they're examined all on their own, which obviously has many implications about this loneliness, this individuality on Rosh HaShana, on a person's din. But on a simple level, I think it's obvious that, especially after the month of Elul, when we are preparing for Rosh HaShana, going through quite an intensive period of self-examination and shuvah and correcting our ways and so on and so forth, it's very interesting to note that when we actually get to the day itself, the day of Rosh HaShana, the day of the din itself, this individuality seems to disappear. So much so that, in fact, in the davening itself on Rosh HaShana, besides the tefillah of the Tana Tokef, which historically is actually an addition to the davening on Rosh HaShana, it's not actually part of the original text of the davening. In fact, in a lot of the other Eidot of Am Yisrael amongst the Sephardi communities, it's actually not really part of the actual davening. In fact, even in our davening, it's not part of the Amidah itself. It's only mentioned afterwards in Chazrat HaShatz by the Chazan, because it actually is a later addition. And even though in the Tana Tokef it's got very personal and individual connotations in it, mi yicheh, mi yamut, and so on and so forth, who will live and who will die, the davening itself on Rosh Hashanah actually seems to be void completely of sort of putting emphasis on the individual. In fact, in the Sidur Ishei Yisrael, which is a Sidur, it's basically a collection of comments of the Gra and the Talmidim of the Gra on the davening. In his introduction to the davening on Rosh Hashanah, he pointed out very clearly that Chazal refrained and avoided any sort of personal tefillot on Rosh Hashanah. His language over there is actually quite harif, that it's actually not allowed. Any mention of sin, of personal introspection is not allowed. Not only is that not allowed, but he even points out that Chazal encouraged us not even to ask for personal things at all. And this obviously is in line with the other parts of the davening, where if you look at the davening on Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur, especially on Rosh HaShana, the main focus of the davening on Rosh HaShana is the concept of Malchut Hashem, the kingdom of Hashem, Hamlachat Hashem. And I'll just read maybe a few of the things that we say in the davening. We say things like, Uvacheni Tkadash Shimcha Hashem Elokeinu Ani Salamecha, may your name be sanctified. And then afterwards we say, Uvacheni Ten Pachtacha Hashem Elokeinu Kol Masecha, may you put your fear and your awe on all of your creations. Uvacheni Ten Kavod, in your honor. And afterwards, obviously, in the bracha itself of the Malchiyot, there's a lot of emphasis placed on this central idea of the Malchut of the Shem, of the Hamlacha of Hashem. And the question is, how do we understand this apparent discrepancy on the one hand of being conscious of the fact that we are standing as individuals in front of Hashem, but on the other hand, when it comes to the actual time itself, we are actually called upon to seemingly avoid that, and actually concentrate more, and apparently only, on Hamlachat Hashem, on the kingdom of Hashem. And I think the way to understand this could be understood based on the comments of Rav Kook, the Sidur Olat Re'iyah, right at the beginning of the Sidur, on something which we say every morning when we wake up. As we know, the first thing we say when we wake up in the morning is Modeh ani lefanecha melecha v'kayam shechazarta bi nishmati v'chemna rabba emunatecha. And Rav Kook over there on the word melech chai v'kayam explains that what do we mean when we talk about the Hashem being a melech, Hashem being the king of the world, and what's this concept of Malchut Hashem, the kingdom of Hashem? And Rav Kook explains that the concept of Malchut and Hashem being a melech stems from the fact that when we look at the world that we live in, we notice immediately. In fact, he says even first thing in the morning when you open your eyes and you just sort of glance around you, you see a kingdom. A kingdom has got a certain ordinary pattern to it, and it contains, multiple things in it, which seem to have a certain organization, a certain theme, a certain inherent sort of harmony in all elements of the kingdom, and that basically is what tells us that we know that there's a melech. Because if there's a kingdom and you see malchut in the world, so then you can relate to the melech that, if you like, is responsible behind that. But the concept over here of melech and malchut actually calls upon a person to actually look beyond themselves and notice the world that we live in. That we live in a malchut, we live in a kingdom. And I think that the idea that Chazal were impressing upon us on Rosh HaShana is to concentrate on the concept of melech, malchut Hashem, is not causing us to actually move away from our individuality, but more importantly, it's actually trying to help us put our individuality into context and to understand that our individuality isn't only about me, myself, and I, and what exactly is my concerns, and what exactly are my desires, and what exactly are my ritzonot. It doesn't all revolve only around me, only around the individual. The appreciation of the significance of the individual actually is dependent on understanding how we fit into a mamlacha, into a kingdom of Hashem. And when we understand that, we can actually appreciate more the value of our individuality. Not only appreciate it more, but maybe try and help us understand how we're supposed to fit into that malchut, into that kingdom of Hashem. And maybe even cause us to have a certain shift in our desires as to what exactly we want. What do we want in order to fit into this malchut of Hashem? I'll just maybe read one word of Rav Kook in his commentary over there on the word melech, and then that we say in the morning. He says the following sentence, that when a person notices this, he says, beladat, to know, Ki omed hu lifnei melech olamim, that we stand in front of the king of the world because we see this kingdom, we see the malchut in the world, and then we understand sheyesh shutra pratit shel adam, that a person's own individual reality, היא אחת מהכוננויות של הממלכה העליונה. That you are part of that kingdom, that each and every individual is part of that malchut, the kingdom of Hashem, which helps us understand maybe what we should be asking for. What is our responsibility? It's not just a responsibility to our own individual self, and maybe sometimes to our very small, close circle, but it even stems far beyond that. And in conclusion, I'll just quote another famous quote of Rav Kook, where he says the following thing. האדם צריך לחלץ תמיד ממסגרותיו הפרטיות. Says Rav Kook, a person should always try and free themselves from their private limitations, their private boundaries, frameworks. הממלאות את כל מהותו, which those private boundaries actually usually fill a person's whole essence, עד שכל רעיונותיו סובבים תמיד רק על דבר גורלו הפרטי. So much so that what normally happens is that a person is always only concerned and involved in their own personal fate. And says Rav Kook, שזהו מוריד את האדם לעומק הקטנות, which actually brings a person down to a very low level, a place of smallness. And he says, ואין קץ לייסורים גשמיים ורוחניים המסובבים מזה. And he says there's actually no end to the yisurim, the suffering, both the physical and the spiritual suffering that such a perspective on life can cause. So what should one do? אבל צריך שתהיה מחשבתו רצונו ויסוד רעיונותיו נתונים להכללות. A person should always constantly have a perception and understanding of the hachlalot, of the general picture, of the mamlacha of Hashem, of this kingdom that a person lives in. Lichlalut hakol, the general reality of everything. The world, le'adam, a person, lichlalut Yisrael, of klal Yisrael, the chol ha'yikum, the whole of the universe, the whole of reality. And then he says, umizeh, if a person has that perspective, titbases etzlo gam ha'pratiyut shelo b'tzura ruya. When a person has that perspective, so their own individuality can find its true and meaningful base. And I think it goes without saying that especially in this year, in the year we were going into 5781, which has been a very difficult year, a very challenging year with the pandemic that's going on. But I think amongst the other things that it's taught us to understand is that we don't live in a bubble. No individual lives on their own. There's a certain mutual responsibility, and that mutual responsibility extends so much beyond a person's own self. And that apparently is certainly one of the major ideas and concepts of this concept of Malchut Hashem, the Malchut of Hashem. Not against a person's individuality, but rather to put our individuality in its proper context as being part of the Malchut of Hashem. I wish you all a Shana Tova.